Okay, so the last week of content then is on the biological arguments for there being some genetic element to traits. Okay, so the biological arguments for explaining personality actually go back a long way, and the examples of these approaches being intertwined with trait approaches also goes well back, even as far back as the ancient Greeks, who had the four humors theory, okay, which was an argument over how temperament can be explained, essentially arguing that there are four temperaments or four humors. And the perspective here was that these differences in temperament were due to differences in biological liquids like black bile and yellow bile and so on. Now, obviously, the biological reasons that they had for these personality differences were incorrect, right? But the characterizations that explained each of the four humors have actually stood the test of time. Because if we look at the characteristics making up these different temperaments, they can essentially be explained using two personality trait dimensions, and that's extraversion and emotional stability, neuroticism. So if you look at each of these four traits, or four temperaments rather, one of them is explaining someone who is low in extraversion, low in emotional stability, and one's explaining vice versa, right? One explaining high in emotional stability, high in extraversion, and so on. And actually, these two personality trait dimensions of extraversion and neuroticism are the two most essential dimensions to Hans Eysenck's theory of personality. Now, Hans Eysenck was a trait theorist, and his model emerged between Raymond Cattell's model and the Big Five factor. But because his theory is so rooted in biology, I'm saving it to discuss this week. And then we'll also talk about Geoffrey Gray, whose work was really directly following Hans Eysenck's. And then probably as far as I'll get today is with Colin DeYoung, who's really began this new subfield of personality psychology called personality neuroscience. And then picking up again on Thursday, we'll talk about the genetic studies that have been done on personality and the evolutionary arguments as well. So Hans Eysenck, born in Germany, 1916, moved to England at the age of 18 in order to escape the Nazis. He wanted to study chemistry or physics in London, but he was told he didn't have the grades. So he asked, what science do I have the grades for? And he was told psychology. So that's kind of how he fell into that. But he actually ended up not only very much liking it, but also doing very well. He became the head of department at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And by the time of his death, he had written more than 40 books and 700 articles. And right before he died, he was the most cited living psychologist. I should say in more recent years, Hans Eysenck has become a bit more of a controversial figure. We know that he fabricated some results. We know he was paid by the tobacco companies for some of the results that he published. But we can use common sense to kind of disregard some of the findings he had. So for example, in one of his studies, he found that there was no actual direct association between cancer and smoking. It was an indirect relationship because of neurotic personalities. Neurotic personalities are more likely to smoke and are more likely to have cancer. Of course, that's incorrect. There is a more direct relationship there between smoking and cancer. But still, his work is incredibly important in terms of really having a very unique approach to studying personality traits, because his main two personality trait dimensions are extraversion and neuroticism, which are terms that we've came across before. Of course, Carl Jung had already done a lot of work on extraversion by this point, but he's looking at them quite differently, Hans Eysenck. He's looking at these traits in terms of physiological activity or physiological arousal. So for extraversion, for example, it's all about your cortical arousal. And his theory was that some people are chronically over-aroused, meaning there's already a lot of cortical arousal, there's already a lot of stimulation occurring in the brain. And so they're not very likely to seek out stimulation in the outside world, okay? Because that would overstimulate them. They've already got enough arousal going on. And so they're more likely to retreat from stimulation in the outside world and so on. And so that would be someone who would, be characterized as introverted. Whereas on the other end, some people are chronically under-aroused, okay? They don't have as much cortical arousal. There isn't as much stimulation already occurring in the brain. And so they seek out stimulation in the outside world. And that's why they're more likely to socialize and be stimulation seeking and so on. And they would be extroverts. And then his idea regarding emotional stability or neuroticism, right? Emotional stability being the opposite of neuroticism, but it's one spectrum. It's all about the reactivity of the autonomic nervous system and response to stress. So how easily stressed are you, essentially? How reactive are you to stressful stimuli? So his idea here was that, on the low end of neuroticism, some people are really quite stoic. It doesn't take very much, it takes a great deal in order to have them feel anxiety, okay? Because they're naturally quite fearless, okay? Whereas on the high ends of neuroticism, for some people, they're very easily rattled. It doesn't take very much at all to push them over the edge or to have them worked up, to have them anxious, to have them irritable and so on. So some people are much more reactive to stressful stimuli. Now, if we, of course, again, this is a normal distribution for both traits. So most people are going to be near the middle, okay? In regard to that emotional stability example, you probably don't know very many people on the extremely low end who are, never rattled, who are incredibly stoic. You probably don't know a great deal of people on the high end who are, easily rattled by any minor inconvenience or any minor stress. Most people are somewhere near the middle, but for Eysenck, you have a predisposition to be more like one versus the other, okay? And so if we look at kind of what side of the average you fall upon for both of these spectrums, then there's kind of 4 categories here that emerge, and we can look at some of the common characteristics that would make up where you would fall. So for example, if you're low in extraversion and low in neuroticism, you could be described as being pretty thoughtful, controlled, even-tempered. On the opposite end, if you're high in extraversion but high in neuroticism, more aggressive, touchy, impulsive, and so on, right? So if you're high in extraversion but low in neuroticism, more likely to be lively, talkative, outgoing, sociable, a leader. Now, Hans Eysenck also believed in this theory that some people are more genetically predisposed to experiencing mental illness than others. And for him, this was really revealed through where you fell on this neuroticism spectrum. So essentially, if you are high on the neuroticism spectrum, then it doesn't take a great deal to traumatize you, okay? It doesn't take a great deal of traumatic experiences and anxiety-provoking experiences early on in life, okay, for you to be quite heavily psychologically disturbed or traumatized by that, okay? Whereas on the opposite end, some people are naturally more resilient to these sorts of experiences, and Hans Eysenck would say. And so it takes a lot more, okay, to traumatize them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're high in neuroticism, you're guaranteed to have a psychological disorder, okay? But the idea here is that it doesn't take quite as much, okay, for you to be traumatized. It doesn't take quite as much for you to develop an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder, okay? But of course, the environmental circumstances have to also be right, okay, for these sorts of things to develop. Now, based upon your extraversion score, if you're high in neuroticism, then Hans Eysenck believed your extraversion score could reveal something about how this neurotic tendency would manifest itself. So, if you're low in extraversion, i.e. introverted, then the way it might manifest itself is through anxiety, through depression, through OCD, through phobias, okay? So particularly fearfulness. If you're more average on the extraversion spectrum, it might be more likely to be manifested in the form of hysteria. And if you're high in extraversion, there might be more likely to be signs of psychopathy. Okay, so this is for Hans Eysenck, the personality type, if you like, who's more predisposed to criminality and delinquency and antisocial behaviors. But though for a while, these two dimensions were really the only two in Eysenck's theory, and he thought that these were enough to explain human behaviors, as he was observing different populations, particularly the more psychologically disturbed and those within prison populations, because he did begin doing work within criminal psychology, he then realized that these two traits weren't enough to explain all human behaviors, okay? And so he developed this third trait, okay, psychotism, another broad trait, just like extraversion and neuroticism are broad. And so then with these three super traits, we'll call them, that's then Eysenck's pen theory, okay, these three super traits. Now, I'll go on to talk about psychotism in more detail, okay, but it's in terms of its connection to the big five, encompassing characteristics to do with low agreeableness, like low empathy, and then characteristics to do with low conscientiousness, like being impulsive and irresponsible, okay? So even once the big five model became popular, Eysenck was still of the opinion that his model was sufficient enough, okay, that it was broad enough, okay, to explain the wide range of personality traits and so on. Because for him, you know, openness was too connected to creativity and intelligence, so he didn't want it to be a factor of personality. And then psychotism is, you know, subsuming characteristics to do with low conscientiousness and low agreeableness. Whereas, of course, the big five proponents believe that, you know, their model was the one that was broad in its coverage. Now, the Eysenck personality questionnaire does measure all three of these factors or super traits, okay? But it should be said that psychotism is much less internally consistent, okay, than extraversion and neuroticism. Now, that's not surprising because, again, it's a broad factor, right, that's including characteristics to do with low agreeableness and low conscientiousness. And we saw when talking about the big five that there is a small correlation between conscientiousness and agreeableness, but it's a small correlation, right? So what that means is that this factor of psychotism is really quite broad and loosely held together, meaning the characteristics that make it up are only moderately correlated with one another at best, right? Whereas with extraversion and neuroticism, of course, you know, they're much tighter factors, right? The characteristics making up these factors are much more correlated with one another to a higher extent. But despite that, despite the fairly low internal consistency of psychotism, all three of these super traits have high stability, okay, or, you know, retest reliability, meaning if one takes the test again, their score is pretty much the same. And then they also all show validity in that they can predict differences in behaviors, differences in outcomes, differences in preferences, okay? So if we look at someone who's high in psychotism, they're more likely to be aggressive, antisocial, cruel, egocentric, impulsive, suspicious of others. So, you know, because it's making up characteristics at the low end of agreeableness, it's not surprising then that we have, you know, some overlap here. There's characteristics to do with low empathy. And remember, at the extremely low end of agreeableness, it predicts antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic behavior, right, and narcissism. Okay, so again, that's, you know, why there's overlap here. And then also the low end of conscientiousness is more socially irresponsible behavior, right, which also is tying in with these characteristics. Also, those who are high in psychotism, more likely to have alcohol and drug problems, described as being more solitary individuals, more likely to lack empathy, so more likely to be cruel to people, cruel to animals, okay, less likely to, experience a shudder or a pain for on someone else's behalf. They're more likely to enjoy violent films and more likely to enjoy violent scenes within violent films. And then a somewhat surprising finding is that those who score high in psychoticism also score high in creativity. Surprising because, again, openness is the factor in the Big Five model tied to creativity. And there's nothing really here of openness that's being measured in psychoticism, okay? And, there's some different theories on this, but I don't think there's a prevailing one. And Hans Eysenck didn't have much explanation for the connection between psychoticism and creativity. So the way Hans Eysenck describes this is via a hierarchical model. Okay, now this is somewhat similar to ones we've looked at before, like with Alpert and Raymond Cattell, right? With Raymond Cattell's, source traits and then surface traits, but it's a bit more comprehensive in Eysenck's illustration. So there's three super traits, right? There's psychoticism, extraversion, and neuroticism. And again, these are three independent, unique factors that don't overlap with one another, okay? And then at the lower level of all of these are personality traits, right, that make them up. So for extraversion, that's being lively, it's being sociable, it's being enthusiastic, it's being all those other, sub-elements of extraversion that we've looked at. With neuroticism, it's being moody, irritable, anxious, depressed. Again, all of those characteristics we've looked at. And with psychoticism, it's being cruel, inhumane, not having empathy, and so on. But then at the lower end of this is habitual responses and specific responses. So we're narrowing down now more to micro behaviors, right? So, a specific response is just what it says. It's a specific response in a particular situation. So, maybe turning up on time for class today, or maybe deciding to go for a run this morning when you woke up, okay? And of course, if you do these behaviors frequently enough, then they become habitual responses, right? If it's in your nature, or it becomes in your nature to turn up to class on time every time, or if it becomes in your nature to go for a run every time you wake up every morning, right? Then it becomes more like a habitual response. And these habitual responses, certainly if there's habitual responses that group together that all share some common theme, then these really could be evidence of a personality trait, right? So maybe not only do you turn up for class on time every day, but maybe you turn in assignments early every time. Maybe you want to always use your time productively, and so on and so on. And then with all of these habitual responses grouped together, we now have evidence for a trait like being orderly or being punctual, okay? So this is explaining behavior, on 4 different levels, according to Eysenck. And for Eysenck, at the time he developed this model, he believed that other trait theorists like Raymond Cattell had been too focused on the 3rd level of his hierarchical model, okay? Where he was more interested in the super traits, this 4th highest level. So, for example, in Raymond Cattell's work, he had a pretty high benchmark in terms of what constituted a factor, okay? And that's why, according to Eysenck, he was only getting insight into this 3rd level, okay? Whereas if he had a lower benchmark, okay, then he would have been able, through factor analysis, to see evidence of super traits, okay, seeing factors that grouped together. And we saw overlap in Raymond Cattell's factors, right? So presumably, with a lower benchmark, you would have seen some of these factors grouping together and then seen some kind of super factor or super trait. Okay, making sense? Is there any questions so far? Okay, but for Hans Eysenck, the explanation for the differences in these traits resides within genetic and biological differences, okay? For him, the psychological differences that we observe, are that we can observe, okay, but they're secondary, if you like, okay? They're as a consequence to the biological differences, but at the deepest level for Eysenck, it's the biological differences that are actually explaining these differences in personality trait scores, okay? Now, I'll talk about the super traits individually in terms of the biological evidence, but some of the main biological arguments are that there is cross-cultural support for all of these super traits, okay? According to the studies, that I've cited, at least 35 countries have been able to find these 3 super traits through factor analysis, and again, finding normal distributions for them all. Good evidence of stability, again, for all of these traits, okay? If people retake the test, weeks later, months later, even years later, their test scores don't change very much. And then there is good evidence of heritability. So I'll talk about that more on Thursday when we talk about genetic studies, okay? But there is a heritable component to all of these super traits. If your biological parents score high in one of these, you're more likely to score high in that super trait as well. Identical twins are more likely to be similar than non-identical twins, okay, in these super traits. Children who are adopted are more likely to be similar to their biological parents than their adoptive parents, okay, in these traits. So talking about extraversion first, for Hans Eysenck, like I said, this was all explained by differences in cortical arousal. Now, at the core of the idea here is that there are mechanisms in the brain that are to do with inhibitory responses. So, making you more drowsy, sleepy, okay? And then excitatory mechanisms, okay, that make you more alert and awake. And for him, the balance, okay, between these two, it was regulated via the ARAS, the ARAS, which is a structure in the brainstem, okay? So essentially, the ARAS is deciding how much arousal is getting into the brain according to Eysenck, okay? And again, for some people, it's letting in chronically a great deal of arousal, meaning that one is chronically over aroused, okay, because of this high amounts of cortical arousal that's always taking place in the brain. And so for those individuals, they're described as introverted because they don't seek out stimulation from the outside world. They want to retreat from it, withdraw from it, okay, because they'll be overstimulated. Whereas on the opposite end of that is those who are not getting a great deal of cortical arousal, and they're classed as extroverts because they're then seeking out stimulation through engaging with the outside world. So that would explain then why introverts are usually more reserved, more withdrawing, more, prone to withdrawing from certain stimuli over arousal. Whereas extroverts are usually described as being more, sociable, more lively, more outgoing, and more stimulation seeking as well. So just from Eysenck's book, just a illustration of where the ARAS is on the brainstem. Now, that's the argument, okay, that Eysenck laid out. What's actually then the evidence, okay? Is this idea supported? Well, actually, there is a great deal of amounts of evidence that introverts are more easily over-aroused, okay, than extroverts. There's a number of examples here, though some have been better replicated than others. But for example, it takes more painkillers, medication for introverts to feel the effect than it does extroverts. Introverts are less tolerant of electric shocks and pain. Introverts have a more increased heart rate in response to threatening stimuli. Introverts find it harder to concentrate on a given task when there's noise in the background, presumably because it overstimulates them, okay, in comparison to extroverts. Introverts perform worse on tests and tasks once they've had caffeine, again, likely because, according to this, it overstimulates them, whereas it doesn't have the same negative effects on extroverts, okay, maybe because it's stimulating to a more optimal level. And then PET scans reveal that the frontal lobes of introverts are more active, okay, than those of extroverts. Now, like I say, some of these have been well replicated. Okay, the finding that introverts find it harder to concentrate on tasks when there's noise in the background. That's a robust finding now, okay, it's been well replicated, okay. Various different methods, okay, with different music or different noise in the background, okay, finding the same effects. The introverts find it very hard to concentrate on a task, okay, when there's this sort of distraction going on, whereas extroverts aren't so easily distracted. And in some cases, some extroverts even perform better when there's some music going on or something in the background. Some of them less replicated, okay, such as introverts having more increased heart rate than extroverts in response to threatening stimuli. There's a whole range of factors that go into explaining differences in heart rates, okay, so it might be very difficult in some samples to get a one-to-one relationship. So overall, the kind of general takeaway is that, yes, introverts do seem to be more sensitive to certain stimuli. They do seem to be more overstimulated, okay? But they're not more chronically aroused at rest than extroverts, okay? In the absence of stimulating stimuli, there's no real difference in cortical arousal between introverts and extroverts, okay? There's only real difference in physiological arousal in the presence of some stimulating stimuli, okay? And his idea on the ARAS was much too simplified, right? The ARAS doesn't work like a tap in the way that Eysenck described it, just letting in, arouse or not, okay, for different individuals. So we would say probably about half right, okay, in regard to his ideas on extroversion. So that's his ideas on extroversion and the evidence to back it up. Then what about neuroticism? So his idea here is that neuroticism is determined by the reactivity of the atomic nervous system, i.e., how responsive is it to stress, okay? Now, for example, in one study, he found that soldiers after World War II who were more traumatized scored higher in neuroticism, okay? Versus those who were less traumatized who scored lower in neuroticism, and it was a significant difference. We would say that those individuals had post-traumatic stress disorder, right? But that wasn't the term being used at the time. And his argument in this paper was that there was causality here, that the individuals who were high in neuroticism had always been high in neuroticism, and so they had been more traumatized by the experiences in the war, okay? And that's why they were then showing more evidence of, shock afterwards, because it took less to traumatize them. Whereas those who were lower in neuroticism, it took less, okay, it would take more to overstress them, okay, to traumatize them. And they were more resilient, okay, to the experiences they endured at war. But what's the obvious critique or limitation of this argument that Eysenck's laying out? Can we actually demonstrate causality from this? No, why not? Because we don't know what the scores were before the war, right? Okay, he's assuming that those who were high in neuroticism were high before, and those low were low before, okay? But actually, you've all seen questionnaires measuring neuroticism. It's measuring anxiety and characteristics that would probably overlap with symptoms of a post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? And so it's certainly not the case, okay, that it's clear from that those who score high would always have scored high, okay? It might be a consequence of the trauma that they endured in the war. But I'll say that more recent studies have found that soldiers after the war with post-traumatic stress disorder who score low in neuroticism are more likely to overcome their post-traumatic stress disorder, okay, more quickly, and then more likely to go back to normal lives with more positive life outcomes. Whereas those with post-traumatic stress disorder in therapy who are high in neuroticism, they're less likely to overcome their post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, it certainly is the case from evidence that the atomic nervous system is more reactive, okay, in those who score high in neuroticism. Parts of the brain that are involved in flight and fight responses are more active in those higher in neuroticism than those lower, okay? But, again, it's a correlation, right? And it's been hard to demonstrate the causality that Eysenck argued for, okay? Because, of course, if you're experiencing anxiety psychologically, that's going to come hand in hand with physical characteristics of anxiety, right? And it's not always clear which one is, coming first, which one's causing the other, or if they're just two things coexisting. And then, his third super trait is psychotism. And his two main biological arguments for explaining differences in psychotism are, first of all, differences in baseline rates of testosterone. And that those higher in testosterone are more likely to have higher psychotic characteristics. Certainly, men do score higher in psychotism than women do. And violent prisoners have been found to score higher in psychotism and also have, higher baseline rates of testosterone. And then his other argument is the low activity variants of the MAOA gene. So the MAOA gene is responsible for the reuptake of dopamine and serotonin, okay? Two neurotransmitters I'll talk about in more detail, but, of course, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that encourages approach behavior. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that dampens negative emotion. Now, there is a low activity variant of this gene, okay, often referred to as the warrior gene, okay, because it's been found in a number of boxers and violent athletes and some other well-known individuals. But it's also been found to be more common to criminal populations than non-criminal populations. So this low activity variant of the MAOA gene, okay, means that one typically has a serotonin deficiency, okay? So they're going to be more irritable and so on because of the consequences that come from that. And also will have likely more higher levels of dopamine, okay? So there's then going to be, more approach behavior. But I'm going to talk more about dopamine and serotonin when we talk about Jeffrey Gray. Now, indeed, a number of studies have found a correlation between this low activity variant of the gene and violent antisocial behavior that would come with being high in psychotism, okay? But there are some caveats, okay? Usually there also has to be some environmental experiences, okay? So, the most replicated findings from this field come from samples in which one was physically abused as a child, okay? And they also have the low activity variants of the MAOA gene. It's typically only if they have both, okay, they're then at an increased risk of violent behavior once they're adults. And the type of aggression matters as well. It's a reactive sort of violence, okay, that the low activity variant of this gene has been tied to, okay? So when one feels provoked or they're experiencing some exclusion or some stress, okay, it's a more defensive sort of aggression rather than the more predatory, cold-blooded, calculating type of aggression, right? That would be proactive aggression. Okay, so Eysenck's theory is very comprehensive and it does have strong support for it, okay, in terms of the genetic evidence and some of the other biological evidence I've discussed. And then there are real applications of it. The Eysenck personality questionnaire is still pretty frequently used, not as much as the Big Five, but it was the mainly used questionnaire for some time. There are some, though, limitations in, for example, inconsistencies in results. So, like I described, not all of those differences between introverts and extroverts have been well replicated. Maybe too simplistic. 3 dimensions of personality, does that seem like enough to explain, the wide range of human behaviors that there are and all the differences and so on. Psychoticism is pretty low in internal consistency. And then it's heavily, heavily focused on biological explanations. It's not really giving any acknowledgement to any of the environmental factors we've already looked at that impact personality, right? Like differences in, parenting styles, sibling relationships, and so on. Okay, and then Geoffrey Gray was a doctoral student of Hans Eysenck, and so it's not surprising that his work is directly following, okay, Hans Eysenck's work. And Geoffrey Gray's work is really well regarded, okay? His ideas here are looking at the brain mechanisms within animals and then trying to translate, okay, some of those findings into human behaviors. So the ideas here are very much based upon conditioning, meaning that there are behaviors that you're more likely to perform because of previous rewards. Some behaviors you're less likely to perform because it's been previously punished, okay? But also that these are closely tied to systems in the brain, networks in the brain, okay? Or rather, it's the networks in the brain that are governing, okay, these differences in conditioning. So there is a behavioral approach system, okay, which governs your responses to rewards, okay, including how well you condition, okay, with positive rewards and so on. So this network in the brain is all about picking up on cues for rewards in your environment, okay, and then encouraging you to go after that behavior or continue with that motivation, okay, if there's signs of rewards and signs that things are going well, okay. And then there's a behavioral inhibition system, okay, which responds to signs of punishments or things not going well, okay. They would discourage you from continuing with that behavior, okay. So it's inhibiting you because it's making you fearful, okay, that there might be punishments or things might not go well, okay. And people will differ in terms of the sensitivity in both of these systems, okay. So, behavioral approach system, maybe you're approaching someone in a bar, right? Someone who you're attracted to, and then you're flirting, they're flirting back. There's signs that things are going well, okay? This network in the brain is telling you, continue with this behavior, okay? Because there's things going well, okay, according to what your brain's picking up on. Whereas the behavioral inhibition system would be picking up on possible signs of rejection or signs of failure, right? It's telling you to retreat, to withdraw from this, okay? So it's what's causing you anxiety, okay? Whereas the behavioral approach system is what causes you to be, enthusiastic and excited, okay? Anticipate that things are going well, okay? So Geoffrey Gray and other proponents of his model have kind of remodeled Eysenck's ideas using this spectrum of impulsivity, okay, which is really determined by the sensitivity of your behavioral approach system, okay? And for Gray, this is closely tied to what Hans Eysenck calls extraversion, okay? And then the behavioral inhibition system is governing anxiety, okay, which of course is closely tied to Hans Eysenck's idea on neuroticism. So these are almost like two personality dimensions, right? We have the sensitivity of your behavioral approach system, which is anticipating positive events, okay, determining your feelings of enthusiasm and anticipation, okay, and it's linked also to impulsivity. And then we have a dimension, determined by the sensitivity of your behavioral inhibition system, okay, picking up on threats and cues of punishments, okay, that's then causing feelings of anxiety and explaining differences in anxiety, and what anticipates negative events. Now, I'm going to go a bit deeper and explain some of the neuropsychology of the behavioral approach system and the behavioral inhibition system. So before I do, let me just explain briefly, some of the core elements of the brain that we'll be talking about. So the limbic system, of course, often referred to as the reptilian brain, okay, because it's deep within the brain. It's an old part of the brain, okay. It's largely responsible for memory, emotions, tracking motivation, right, and pairing all of these together as well, right? Because, if you're pursuing a motivation and things are going well, that's going to cause positive emotion, right? That's essentially what positive emotion is, okay, that things are going well towards the motivation that you're trying to achieve. Whereas negative emotion is essentially the opposite, right? That things are not going well, that you're not on track to receive the motivation that you want to achieve, right? So some core parts of the brain, the amygdala, very much involved in conditioning, right? Pairing experiences with emotion, okay? So we talked, for example, about baby Albert when we talked about, behaviorism, right? It was to do with the pairing of stimuli, right? Baby Albert wasn't initially afraid of the baby rat, but once it was paired with the hammering of a steel bar, then because of the pairing of these two stimuli, eventually baby Albert was afraid of the rat, right? Now, this pairing of stimuli indicates that baby Albert had good amygdala function, okay? Because the amygdala is crucial for this sort of fear conditioning, okay? When one has a defected amygdala, or when the amygdala is removed from animals like race monkeys, okay, they are no longer able to fear condition, okay? They can't tie stimuli together, and they can't anticipate negative consequences or anticipate, okay, fear in the way that one would from previous fear conditioning. And then the hippocampus, heavily involved in the consolidation of memory, right? Also part of the brain that's fairly fluid, right? So, for example, in London, taxi drivers have to undergo a pretty intense 6-month training program to memorize all the various routes that there is in London, so they can get from one place to the other in the quickest routes possible. And the hippocampus actually gets larger after this training program, okay, because it's involved in the consolidation of memory, right? So you're using this part of the brain, so it's getting larger. And then the hypothalamus is really the center of the limbic system, right? It's really the origins of behaviors to do with the 4 Fs, right? You know the 4 Fs from intro to psych, right? Feeding, fighting, fleeing, and the other F that means sex, right? Okay, so any behaviors to do with these, okay, originates in the hypothalamus. And the nucleus accumbens is really a lateral part of the hypothalamus that then is involved in the translation of emotion to action, right? Okay, so according to Jeffrey Gray, the behavioral approach system is largely made up of dopamine circuits and then the nucleus accumbens, okay, this part of the hypothalamus. So I briefly mentioned this, but dopamine, again, is the neurotransmitter, right, that encourages approach behavior, okay, because it gives you a good feeling, okay, when things are going well, so that then encourages you to continue with the behavior that you're on, okay, so that you're then going to continue pursuing this motivation, okay. So it's what you get in response to incentive rewards, right? But if you actually run that motivation to the end, okay, and if you achieve what you wanted to achieve, it's then serotonin that's the neurotransmitter that's experienced, okay? And these are very differences, or these are very different feelings, right? With dopamine comes enthusiasm and excitement and anticipation, right? With serotonin, there comes a dampening of negative emotion and a feeling of contentness, right? A feeling of satisfaction. But it's not the same kind of, jumping up and down in excitement, okay, that comes with dopamine, okay? It's a dampening of irritability, a dampening of depression, a dampening of anxiety that comes with serotonin, a feeling that leaves you satisfied and content, right? It's two different feelings. So serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I'm sure you've all heard of, right, are a common treatment for those with depression, those with a serotonin deficiency, right? And that's the the treatments, right? Because we're dampening negative emotion, okay? So it's a difference, right? We don't give dopamine kicks, right, to those with depression, okay? Well, Sigmund Freud prescribed cocaine, which is a good way of getting a dopamine kick, okay? But with that exception, okay? Psychologists don't really give a dopamine kick to those with depression, right? It's increasing levels of serotonin. So, you know, a serotonin deficiency can lead to serious problems. It's been found in that those who committed suicide had extremely low levels of serotonin at the time. Reactive offenders, okay, who engage in physical violence have been found to have lower levels of serotonin. Because if you have low levels of serotonin, you know, you're easily bothered, you're easily rattled, right? Because you're more irritable, you're more moody, you're more anxious, you're more depressed, you're more, all of these negative emotions, okay? Whereas if you have high levels of serotonin, because serotonin is dampening negative emotion, you're not very easily bothered, okay? You're not very easily irritated, okay? Because you are more likely to feel, well, this sense of emotional stability. So positive emotion can, of course, come in many forms, but it's that which encourages you to approach and to continue pursuing the behavior that you're on or the motivation that you're on. So it could be, you know, a feeling of curiosity, a feeling of joy, a feeling of hope, a feeling of, you know, intense interest in what this is. And very much tied to this is the incentive motivation of extraversion by DeYoung and Collins. So in this model, positive emotions are basically just impulses to keep going after a particular goal or a particular motivation, okay? And this is governed by the behavioral approach system, okay, described by Jeffrey Gray. So again, they're responding to incentive rewards, right? Signs that things are going well, okay? And then that's giving you a dopamine kick, okay, from these incentive rewards. And these dopamine kicks are basically positive emotions, okay? And then they're continuing you on with this approach behavior. And in this idea, extraversion is essentially just how sensitive the behavioral approach system is, okay? How much positivity one experiences, okay, from incentive rewards. So extraversion is positively predictive of positive priming effects, okay? Now, to be clear, it's not predictive of negative affecting priming effects because negative emotions are governed by a separate system, the behavioral inhibition system. So I want to make that clear. There's no overlap here, okay? They are distinct systems, one responsible for positive emotion, one responsible for negative emotion. So it's certainly possible to feel neutral, right, in which there isn't a great deal of positive emotions or a great deal of negative emotions. Now, to give further merit, if you like, to this argument, extroverts do have more dopamine receptors than introverts, okay? So they do respond with more enthusiasm to incentive rewards, okay? And they do respond with more excitement at the idea of attaining such rewards as well. Now, whether this is a difference that's innate or a difference in environmental experiences is still up for debate, right? It might be the case that extroverts always had more dopamine receptors. It might have been the case that because of a more enthusiastic, positive upbringing or something such as that, they had more dopamine receptors as a consequence, okay? That part of the puzzle is still not quite figured out. So negative emotions governed by a separate system, right? The behavioral inhibition system. And these are really feelings to do with defensiveness and avoidance, okay? When you respond to threats or cues of punishments. Now, when we think of negative emotions, you know, we think of pain, we think of anxiety, we think of fear. Certainly all governed by the behavioral inhibition system. But disgust is an exception. Remember, disgust is associated with conscientiousness, right? It's not associated with neuroticism, and it doesn't actually correlate with these other negative emotions. So it would seem to be governed by a separate system. This is just, an illustration that might help make sense of what I'm talking about. So, if you have a motivation you want to pursue, so you have an idea in your mind of what you want, you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, okay? When you're engaging in a behavior, there's one of two things that can happen, right? There can be signs of promise, signs of things going well, that you're going to get the predicted outcome that you want, okay? Which will then come with it feelings of hope and pleasure, these positive emotions, okay? Because you're responding to incentive rewards with, dopamine kicks. Or there could be signs that things are not going well, okay? There could be signs of rejection, signs of threats, okay? That then cause you feelings of anxiety and cause you to retreat, okay, from this particular goal, okay? So you no longer are going to pursue it because it's too fearful to do so, okay? The fear of rejection is too much, so instead you're going to turn away. Now, there's differences in sensitivity here. There's a great deal of variation, right? Because sometimes the outcome can't be accurately predicted, right? Sometimes, if you're particularly anxious, and the worst case that you can imagine actually, in some cases, might be the worst case, and it might be actually what happens, right? But in other cases, you might be panicking too much, okay? And it might actually, not turn out as negative as you think. But it's not always entirely clear, right? Which is why there's then variation in how sensitive you might be to particular cues in the environment. Now, I've told you really about two types of positivity, right? I've told you about the positivity that comes from a dopamine kick, which is like excitement and enthusiasm that comes in response to incentive rewards. And I've told you about the feeling of contentness and satisfaction that comes from high serotonin levels, which is when one has already fulfilled the goal and achieved what they wanted, okay? So they've got this consummatory reward. So, think if you're going on vacation, right? Sometimes the build up to it is actually more exciting, okay? And it's a different form of happiness, a different form of positivity than actually being on the vacation, okay? When you're sitting by the pool relaxing, that's more like a feeling of contentness and satisfaction, right? Which will come with it probably high levels of serotonin, right? Whereas the build up and excitement is probably more likely to come with high levels of dopamine. And I think a clear way of understanding it is looking at the differences in the two forms of happiness in dogs, right? So, when a dog is chasing after something, you can clearly see it having this dopamine kick. It's experiencing this, enthusiasm and positivity. It's going after what it wants, right? And it's experiencing here some dopamine. But then also you have this kind of, picture of a satisfied dog, or what a dog looks like when it's lying down getting its belly scratched, right? It's a more feeling of contentness and satisfaction, right? Which probably comes with high serotonin. Okay, so consummatory rewards are those that we achieve once we've run the motivation to its end, comes with high levels of serotonin, feels satisfied. And then incentive rewards are those that tell us things are going well, okay, and that we're going to get the outcome that we want, okay? They come with its dopamine activation and feelings of enthusiasm, excitement. Now, these incentive rewards, they can be as a consequence of conditioning, of past experiences, okay, but they could also be innate, okay? There's some, promises of things going well that are more naturally picked up on. And then on the other side is the punishments, right? Signs that things are not going well, okay? That things are going to turn out bad, that you're going to be rejected, that you're going to fail, that bring about all these feelings of fear and anxiety. So, punishments are those that we've learned from previous experiences, most likely will punish this behavior, okay? And so we should discontinue this behavior because it comes with it, feelings of pain, frustration, grief, and so on. Now, again, these can be learned, okay? You can have previously learned that these will lead to punishments. Or again, they could be innate, right? We talked about this in the behaviorist week. There's some fears that seem to be more innate, like a fear of snakes, okay, that are found in many animals, even when they haven't had exposure to snakes before. Okay, and then this feeling of anxiety is dampened, again, by serotonin, and also the neurotransmitter GABA, okay? And, usually when one has alcohol, GABA is the neurotransmitter that's then at play, okay, dampening feelings like anxiety and so on. Okay, and then the responsibility of the system here is really reflected in one's neuroticism score, okay? Okay, is there any questions? I'm not finished yet, okay, but I hope I've kind of so far simplified this enough that you could follow along. Okay, I just have one other thing I want to talk about, okay, and that's Colin DeYoung's work on personality neuroscience. Now, it's a much more recent subfield of personality. I think it's a very, very exciting subfield of personality psychology. It's using the Big Five model as a framework and looking at the neurological correlates with differences in scores on each of the Big Five factors, okay? It's, again, a very new field, and I think, within the next 10 years, there's going to be, major findings that will completely revolutionize personality psychology. I'm going to do my best to simplify as much as I can this review by DeYoung, really just giving you the basics that you need for this course, okay? But I do recommend the paper you can read for yourself by Allen and DeYoung. It's, I think, a very readable, accessible paper, okay? Even if you don't know a lot about all the parts of the brain being discussed, Colin DeYoung still writes in a way that's very easily digestible, okay? Much more so than Jeffrey Gray, okay? If you're interested in clinical psychology, I really recommend the Neuropsychology of Anxiety by Jeffrey Gray, okay? Jeffrey Gray is one of the most well-regarded clinicians in clinical psychology. But his work is very dense, okay? It's heavy reading, okay? Whereas Colin DeYoung, I think, writes in a more accessible way. Okay, so remember, in Colin DeYoung's model that we looked at, which was the Big Five aspect scale, there's two meta traits, right? There is stability, which is responsible for differences in agreeableness, emotional stability, conscientiousness. And what Colin DeYoung has found is that this is heavily tied to networks to do with serotonin. And then there is the plasticity meta trait, right? Which at the lower level has extraversion and openness, which DeYoung has found correlates with differences in dopamine levels. But like I say, each of these Big Five traits have their own unique neurological correlates, and we're only really just beginning to uncover what they are. So this is just a reminder of DeYoung's model, right? So we have the two meta traits, the 5 factors, and then the 10 aspects. And then, of course, at a lower level, there'll be micro behaviors and habits and so on, okay? Unagreed upon amount of characteristics, right? Again, before the exam, make sure you're confident on the differences between all these aspects, right? It won't be as simple as just, is this person high in conscientiousness or low in conscientiousness? You have to know which aspects they're high and low in, okay? So the recommended reading this week is DeYoung's original paper on the Big Five aspect scale, okay, which is on Canvas. And that could help you further go into the differences between the aspects. So in personality neuroscience, what's essentially being done is looking at questionnaire responses on Big Five questionnaires, and then seeing correlations between those scores and responses on one of these techniques, okay? So it could be, neuroimaging techniques to see which parts of the brain are active and how active it is, looking at the structure of the brain to see if there's differences in volume between different people. And it could be differences in genetics, differences in brain activity, differences in hormones, neurotransmitters, differences based upon medication that one might take. So in regard to extraversion, the association between extraversion and the dopamine network is pretty robust at this stage, okay? There is evidence using a wide range of different methods here, okay, that all point in the same direction. That is that those who are higher in extraversion, okay, are more likely to have more dopamine receptors, more likely to have more intense dopamine reactions to incentive rewards, okay? So they're more enthusiastic about getting rewards, they're more pleasure-seeking, they're more, reward-seeking, and they're more likely to feel a sense of enjoyment from gaining those rewards as well. So Extroversion's pretty well understood, okay? Jeffrey Gray kind of done the work that needed to be done on that, okay? It's some of these other traits like openness, okay, that Colin DeYoung's opened new avenues on. So openness has been conceptually linked to dopamine, meaning that at the big five level, openness hasn't been found to correlate with dopamine, okay? But if we look at the characteristics of openness, then some characteristics like novelty seeking, that does correlate with differences in dopamine levels. Differences in curiosity, okay, that also correlates with differences in dopamine levels. Now, remember, openness is a very, very broad dimension, right? So that might be why at the big five level, it's not correlating with dopamine, okay? Because there's only some characteristics of it that are involved with the dopamine network. And then openness also, to a small extent, correlates with extraversion, right? And extraversion does correlate strongly with differences in dopamine. Openness, sometimes referred to as the cognitive exploration factor by DeYoung, is the only big five trait that's been found to be associated with working memory, right? And then it's also been found to be associated with reduced latent inhibition. Now, latent inhibition is when one is able to disregard all of the irrelevant stimuli in their environment and only focus on that which is relevant, okay? So, you know, there's something that you're looking for, that's what your eyes are on. You're not really taking in, encoding any information that's also in your line of vision, okay? Whereas those higher in openness, okay, have been found to have reduced latent inhibition, meaning they're more likely to pay attention to irrelevant details, okay, even when there's something to focus on. And given that openness is connected to creativity, you know, it might be drawing connections between things that appear to be irrelevant to one another. That might be part of, you know, creativity in some cases. And then also tied to dopamine is the novelty-seeking personality traits, okay, which, you know, is an important component of openness. So there is a dopamine receptor gene, okay, called the DRD4 gene. And if one has this gene, they score higher in novelty-seeking questionnaires, and they're more likely to get a dopamine kick when they experience something novel, okay, than those who don't have this gene, okay? So obviously, if you're getting a dopamine kick, okay, from experiencing something novel, that would explain why you're generally more novelty-seeking, right? And then along these lines, there was an interesting study by Matthews and Butler that looked at the frequency of this gene within various populations, and then looked at this in comparison to the movement of humans across our evolutionary history. And what they found was, if you start where, you know, humans are thought to have started in Northeast Africa, this is where this gene is found in least frequent numbers, okay? And then people are thought to have then moved to Europe and Asia, which is then where this gene is found second least frequently, okay, after Northeast Africa. And then, you know, most recently in our evolutionary history, people have moved to Australia and to the Americas. And it's actually in these places that this gene is found most frequently. So it's one possible explanation for this finding, but the explanation given here is that possibly those who are more novelty-seeking, who are more curious, who are more explorative, were more likely to go further from home. And then that's explaining why their genetic offspring, okay, have ended further away from where human beings started. The kind of main point from openness is it's linked to the dopamine network, okay, especially the curiosity and novelty-seeking aspects of openness, okay? And then agreeableness, emotional stability, and conscientiousness have all been associated with serotonin. Agreeableness, especially politeness, okay, has also been found to correlate with lower levels of baseline testosterone rates, okay? And agreeableness has also been found to correlate with some differences in brain structure volumes as well. The dorsolateral region of the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in taking on the perspective of others, okay, and theory of mind, okay. If one has damage to the dorsolateral region of the prefrontal cortex, they're then impaired in their ability for theory of mind, okay. And what's been found is that this part of the brain is actually larger in those who are higher in agreeableness versus those who are lower. Now, given that an important component of agreeableness is empathy, right, it's then not surprising that there might be a connection here, because taking on the perspective of others and putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to understand what they're thinking and feeling is all crucial parts of having empathy, right? And then with neuroticism, Colin DeYoung's put a lot of emphasis on the role of the amygdala, which again is heavily involved in fear conditioning, okay? So picking up on threats and then tying stressful experiences with negative emotion so that one learns from it in the future. And it's been found that those higher in neuroticism, okay, typically have a more overreactive amygdala in response to stress, okay? Those with a social anxiety disorder often have a more overreactive amygdala. Those with PTSD often have a overreactive amygdala even when they're sleeping, perhaps explaining why they have more emotional dreams. And those higher in neuroticism also show, more amygdala activation in response to situations that for most people would be considered fairly neutral, okay, but they're construing as being somewhat stressful or provoking. And then, interestingly, if we split neuroticism into the two aspects, which remember is withdrawal and volatility, what's been found is that differences in withdrawal are pretty clearly linked to Jeffrey Gray's behavioral inhibition system. And there are questionnaires to measure sensitivity of the behavioral inhibition system and behavioral approach system based upon how they were conceptualized by Jeffrey Gray. So those who are higher in withdrawal, they're more likely to have an overly sensitive behavioral inhibition system, whereas the volatility aspect is more tied to a fight, flight, freeze system in the brain, okay? And if one is higher in volatility, they're more tilted towards a more fight-like response, okay, in response to these sorts of stressful situations. Okay, any questions on what I've said about the neurological correlates here between the big five and these different parts of the brain or neurotransmitters? Okay, right. Well then, thanks everyone. Okay, I'll pick it up next time, okay?